Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having worked on this issue intimately for the last 8 years, I can tell you that my experience over that time was fundamentally different than the last 10 minutes of speeches that we just heard. It actually was a true bipartisan initiative. It was free of the attacks and campaign speeches that we just heard. It was actually sitting around the table. I first went up to Lincoln Hills, 2014, 2015. Certainly wasn't any Republicans on the bill that I first introduced. I wrote a little booklet. It was called Inmate 501. I thought it was a pretty clever title. Did a little presentation, a PowerPoint. Remember the earlier speech about the nerd thing? And actually, I wrote a letter. I penned a letter to Governor Walker, and I sent him a copy of this. And I sat down with his chief of staff. And I had a bill, I think it was 2015 AB 795 or something like that, who knows. And the idea was to use the model out of the state of Missouri. Missouri was a nation leader in dismantling large centralized juvenile prisons and instead have a network, an ecosystem of smaller facilities nearer to the communities where the children come from. It's called the Missouri model when it was first developed. And so we had advocated in that bill to develop that type of model, what is becoming the Wisconsin model. And to their credit, Governor Walker and his chief of staff, about a week later after sending them the letter, said, come on in, let's talk about this. At that moment, Lincoln Hills was really on fire. We're in the middle of lawsuits. They hadn't been settled yet. Kids were getting hurt, guards were getting hurt, and something had to be done. And I want to give the credit where it belongs. And the gentleman from the 39th and I have worked on this for a number of years, but I really want to highlight the gentleman from the 53rd. And not just his work and his passion on this issue, but I just want to tell you a little story. And when I said, and when I began speaking tonight, how different working on the bill was versus the speeches we've heard tonight, the experience that I had, a gentleman from the 53rd and I met, I think, in Oshkosh. I drove from Milwaukee and met him in Oshkosh. Maybe we met in Stevens Point. And we drove the rest of the way to Lincoln County, to Lincoln Hills together in his truck. And he gives me a hard time about comments that I made on the floor because the truck smelled very bad. Mr. Speaker, it smelled bad. It did. And there was hay and things in the bed of the truck, and it was kind of a tight fit. I think there were 5 of us in the pickup truck, and it's a long drive, and we bonded and we talked as colleagues, as men, as legislators. And that was an important trip. But what happened while we were at Lincoln Hills, and I'll highlight a memory and a vision that I have of that experience. The gentleman from the 53rd, we were in one of the barracks, or the cottages as they call them, and some of the youth were there and the guards that were giving us a tour. And the gentleman from the 53rd wanted to break away from the curated tour. He actually wanted to see and talk to the kids without the presence of the superintendent. And so the gentleman from the 53rd and I sat with 2 young men at a table, and we just talked to them. We didn't talk about the Missouri model of juvenile incarceration. We didn't talk to them about bills or funding. We just listened to them. 2 young guys from my neck of the world. And what I watched in the gentleman from the 53rd the transformation in that experience was a coworker that was interested in the policy to a legislator passionate about the issue. And I really, truly believe it was that moment on that the gentleman from the 53rd really committed to this issue. And he and I and others worked very closely, day after day, week after week, month after month, on what then became 2017 Act 185. Now, there were just now levied accusations that Governor Tony Evers did nothing to help this plan advance. And having walked the path of this bill from the beginning to the end, I can tell you that those statements are a version of history that are not true. Governor Evers served on our bipartisan study committee. He, at the time, was the superintendent of the Department of Public Instruction. It was a 25-member committee. He was appointed to that committee and he served. He didn't send a delegate. He was there. I remember sitting next to Tony Evers in the summer of 2018. So he's a candidate for governor. He has not won the Democratic primary yet. And he showed up to the Department of Corrections headquarters out on East Wash Avenue. And he sat through hours and hours and hours of meetings. I remember walking around the room with then DPI Superintendent Tony Evers, voting on locations that we thought were the best. I remember him asking questions about the education of the juveniles. And as we decentralize juvenile corrections, how will the school districts be impacted? Now, Governor Evers is elected in 2018. He has a transition team. And the first seminal document that he puts out is his first biennial budget in the winter of 2019. He might not have written a letter to the Speaker of the Assembly, but he included the necessary funding to finish this 4 years ago. His first budget had this exact same provision to fund the necessary Type 1 juvenile facility for the DOC. And the majority party did not agree to fund that, to the funding in the first budget. What did Governor Evers do in his second biennial budget a year ago? He again sought this exact same funding in his budget. What ended up happening to that funding? It was removed by the Joint Committee on Finance. So I understand the politics. We're all politicians. We understand how this works. This bill, our previous efforts, should be, were, can be examples to teach future generations of how we can work together. The gentleman from Fond du Lac earlier in his final speech talked about that type of bipartisanship. Act 185 was, this bill has been. We don't need that partisan stuff that we just heard. It's factually inaccurate. So let's put it behind us. Let's put it down. Let's pass this bill. Because ultimately, this is about kids, it's about staff, it's about our communities. 20 years from now, no one will care about who did what and who wrote a letter. What will matter is that this gets done. The vote is green.